Have you ever wondered what could drive a seemingly normal man to dismember his wife during their anniversary getaway? The gruesome tale of Joseph Ferlazzo and his wife Emily Jean Schwarz will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and the capacity for human cruelty. It was supposed to be a romantic trip to celebrate their first wedding anniversary. Instead, it ended in a nightmare of violence and dismemberment, and a camper bathroom turned into a makeshift morgue. But let's rewind and see how this horror show unfolded. Joseph Ferlazzo, 41, and Emily Jean Schwarz, 22, seemed like your average newlywed couple. They had tied the knot just a year earlier after a whirlwind romance and were ready to mark the occasion with a getaway to Bolton, Vermont in October 2021. Joseph and Emily had had a rough time. It was the end of the pandemic, and the pair had spent most of the last year living on Emily's mother's property in Northfield, New Hampshire. They'd previously lived in Vermont, but as COVID ravaged the globe, Joseph had a hard time finding work as a tattoo artist and body piercer. Emily, a nursing assistant, was on the front lines and basically became the sole breadwinner. But even that wasn't enough to keep the pair afloat. Now that the worst was over, the couple had had a chance to finally get away and go back to Vermont, hopefully to begin the life they had always dreamed about. It was also a chance for Emily to finally meet Joseph's sister, Nicole. Despite the fact that Emily and Joseph had been married for a year, she hadn't met his family. The pair packed up their converted bus, a cozy little home on wheels they'd fixed up, and hit the road, bringing their dog Remington for the adventure. It was a 2.5-hour drive from New Hampshire to Vermont. The pair were going to a beautiful campsite just off Vermont Route 2 and the Bolton Access Valley Road. Nearby were the Bolton potholes with some of the state's most gorgeous waterfalls. Emily was excited. It was the fresh start she needed after months and months of stress. On Friday, October 15th, she and Joseph rolled into town and parked at a condo complex called Erin around 7:20 p.m. Joseph's sister Nicole and her boyfriend were renting an Airbnb nearby, and the plan was to meet up with them to watch some Netflix. But something was off right from the start. Joseph and Emily only hung out with Nicole for about 15 minutes in the parking lot before heading back to their camper van. Emily sent her last Facebook message to family at 8:13 p.m. By 9:39 p.m., Joseph was texting his sister that they were going to take the night to rest instead of coming over. Emily's finally location ping from Facebook came at 10:14 p.m. What happened next in that camper van is the stuff of nightmares. You see, Emily never made it out of the camper alive. Throughout the evening, the couple had argued relentlessly. Emily, having had enough of the back and forth, decided to go lie down. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Emily was dead, her body parts scattered around the camper. But the story doesn't end there. Rather than calling 911 or showing an ounce of remorse, Joseph immediately set about covering up his crime. He put a Market Basket shopping bag over Emily's head and tied a garbage bag around her neck. Using his 200-pound frame, he then hauled her 130-pound body into the camper's shower stall. And next came the cleanup. Joseph bagged up the bloody pillows, sheets, and other evidence. He gathered Emily's shoes, glasses, wallet, and phone, though he made sure to keep her ID. Then he remade the bed with fresh linens as if nothing happened. And within hours, he was texting his sister again at 7:48 a.m. asking about breakfast plans, acting like it was just another normal day. Over breakfast at a place called Max's, Joseph casually ate eggs and sipped a mimosa while his wife's corpse lay cooling in the camper shower. He then drove the van to St. Albans and parked it at his friend's property, lying that Emily had taken off after an argument. As if to cover his tracks, Joseph sent a text to Emily's phone saying, "Whatever, I'm gonna spend time with Nikki while I can. Call me." Joseph went back to his sister's Airbnb, where he wasted away the next few hours giving her a tattoo, completely at ease, chatting for hours, but never once mentioning that he had killed his young wife. He then spent the entire evening having drinks at a gastropub called Twigs before returning to the van to sleep alongside Emily's body. The next day, Joseph went about his business in Burlington, even stopping to buy bleach on his way back to St. Albans. That night, night, he hung around a campfire with friends, including an off-duty cop, never breathing a word about what he'd done. But Joseph wasn't done violating Emily's body. At some point over the next 2 days, he made the depraved decision to dismember her corpse to make it easier to carry. Using a serrated saw, he hacked off her arms, legs, feet, and head. Her torso was riddled with stab wounds, at least 18 in total, including one that pierced her heart. Joseph had used at least 3 different knives when he mutilated Emily. He then bagged up each body part separately in garbage bags. And on Monday, Joseph drove back to New Hampshire, leaving the camper, Remington the dog, and Emily's remains behind. Back in New Hampshire, Joseph arrived on his motorcycle without Emily. But Adrienne Bass, Emily's mother, immediately knew something was wrong. When she asked Joseph where her daughter was, Joseph told her that the pair had argued on Friday evening just outside Bolton. According to Joseph, Emily had gotten out of the van and began walking down Route 2, telling Joseph she'd call an Uber to take back to New Hampshire. Joseph said that he drove back down the road to a convenience store to grab a drink and cool off. And when he went back to the area where he had left her, Emily was no longer there, and he'd assumed that someone had picked her up. But whether the story was true or not didn't matter to Adrienne. The fact was, her daughter was missing, and her own husband had no idea and not much concern as to where she was. Adrienne and her husband immediately called the police and filed a missing persons report. Adrienne had always had her suspicions about Joseph. On one New Year's Eve, before Joseph and Emily had moved onto her property, Emily called her mother while she was in the bathroom. She told Adrienne that she had locked herself inside, and on the other end of the line, Adrienne could hear her son-in-law screaming at Emily trying to get in the bathroom. More than once, she'd also seen bruises and scratches on Emily. Emily had said that they were from Joseph, but when Adrienne would try to get more information out of her, she would close up. But it was clear to everyone in Emily's life that something was wrong, and had been wrong for a while now. So how did this all come to be? There's not a whole lot of information on Joseph's early life other than he was born in Pennsylvania and moved around quite a lot. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of his childhood has to do with his parents, or rather his stepmother. See, Emily's death wasn't the family's first brush with murder. In October 2009, Joseph's stepmother, Young Hee Lim Ferlazzo, was found stabbed to death in her home. Her husband, Joseph Sr., had found her after returning from a late-night shopping trip. Young Hee Lim was the manager of a massage parlor owned by Joseph Sr., which had actually been raided sometime before her murder. Several of the workers were charged with prostitution, including Young Lee Him's niece. Despite this strange link, Joseph Sr. was never considered a suspect, and the case ran cold. As for Joseph and Emily, they had met in Vermont in 2018. At the time, Joseph was working a steady job as a tattoo artist. He even had an apprentice named Lauren. Lauren was training to become a body piercer, but she lacked what was needed most: a steady hand. There was no way she was ready for real clients, so Joseph encouraged her to practice with her friends and family. And so one day, Lauren brought in her friend Emily to get a piercing. It went well, and the trio made small talk while the procedure was underway. Afterwards, once the tension was gone and they could all relax, Joseph and Emily began chatting. Joseph noticed that Emily was incredibly flirty, even though she was in a relationship. When Emily left that afternoon, Joseph leaned over to Lauren and reportedly said, quote, "I wouldn't mind making her my next ex-wife," unquote. Yes, Joseph had been married before. In fact, he was quite the ladies' man and didn't seem to stick to the ethics that some tattoo artists have of not getting involved with his clients. It almost seemed like he preferred his partners to be his clients, which already suggests an interesting power dynamic. After their first meeting, Joseph and Emily didn't reconnect again until 2020. Joseph had moved to Maine and then back to Vermont, where he'd called Lauren up and asked her if she wanted to hang out. He was couch surfing at the time and wasn't really working. And Lauren was more than happy to meet up and even suggested that he tattoo her and her friend. And of course, that friend was Emily. Joseph followed through and tattooed Emily, and it was roughly 2 weeks after that that this pair began messaging. Initially with the idea of doing a new tattoo. I mean, Emily was single at this point, and that flirtatious nature she'd had when she and Joseph had first met once again reared its head. Joseph was intrigued and asked her if she wanted to go for a motorcycle ride to see the sights, and Emily agreed. And by the time evening came around, the pair were officially dating. There was a 19-year age gap between the two, and the couple's friends definitely had some reservations about it, but that didn't seem to matter to the pair. In August of that year, the couple moved in together, renting a small apartment in Essex. They even turned one of the rooms into a small studio for Joseph's tattoo business. It was a whirlwind romance for sure, and a few months after this, the pair became engaged. Reportedly after Emily asked Joseph if he would marry her. 1 month after this, they were hitched. But there was one issue of contention that the new couple hadn't quite worked out yet. Joseph was polyamorous, and Emily wanted monogamy. To compromise, Joseph agreed to monogamy with a polyamorous clause. When the monogamous streak ran out for him, the pair would be polyamorous. Unsurprisingly, Joseph became bored of the one-woman lifestyle within a couple of months, and that's when the arguments began. The pair were already stressed, low on funds, and living in cramped quarters. To add to this, their attachment styles were wildly different. Joseph saw no issue with messaging clients and random strangers via social media trying to connect and hook up. And for Emily, this was just too much for her to bear. Maybe she thought that marriage would change Joseph, that he'd finally settle down. But whatever her hopes were, they never materialized. Instead, the relationship devolved into a nightmare. And though Emily's friends and family suspected things were bad, they had no idea of what was coming. And now, Emily was missing, and the only person who had seen her last wasn't talking. After Adrian and David Bass had reported Emily missing, the local police tried to get a hold of Joseph to hear his version of events. They ended up managing to connect with him via a call, and Joseph repeated what he had told Adrian. Emily was last seen walking down Route 2, waiting for an Uber to take her back to New Hampshire. One of the factors that Adrian found suspicious about this was how happy Emily had been before the trip. It didn't seem likely that there could have been an argument so bad that she would want to abruptly leave before the trip had even begun. What could have prompted such a dramatic reaction? Meanwhile, Joseph was already on his way to Vermont in his Jeep Wrangler heading to a friend's house. The house was located in Meadowbrook Lane, and Joseph had conveniently left the camper just outside. Once he arrived, he entered the camper to spend the night, but he was by no means sleeping. Instead, he was working meticulously for hours on end, dismembering Emily's body. The plan was to cut her into pieces small enough to transport her to the woods and bury her, with the hope that no one would ever find her remains. But things didn't exactly go according to plan. The next morning, Joseph went to the local Maple Fields, a convenience store. He was aware the police were looking for him, but he didn't know the extent to which the report had spread. It had hit the news, and a server at Maxie's, where he had had breakfast with Nicole, had reported seeing him to the police. And Joseph was pretty recognizable. I mean, he stood out in a crowd. With his curly dark hair, tattoo sleeves, and hulking figure, he was easily identifiable from the rest of the patrons. Along with the report from the server at Maxie's, police also received a call from the friend Joseph had been staying with in St. Albans. His name was Spencer Lemons, and he was concerned about the strange interaction that he'd had with Joseph. When he'd met with Joseph after his return from New Hampshire, Joseph was a shell of his former self. Gone was the confident, egotistical swagger. Instead, Joseph seemed haunted by something. Spencer was going to take him to the camper van, but on the way there, the conversation took an interesting turn. The subject of Emily came up, and Joseph told Spencer that he had done something awful. Spencer worked it out for himself. He asked Joseph if Emily was in the camper and if she was still alive. And Joseph said that her body was there, but no, she was no longer alive. Then he allegedly asked Spencer to shoot him, saying he didn't want to go to prison. It didn't matter that the pair were friends. Spencer wanted nothing to do with the situation. So he called 911, reported the incident, and when he'd last seen Joseph. The morning that Joseph walked into Maple Fields, he had no idea that it would be his last day as a free man. As fate would have it, Sergeant Amy Nolan had walked into the same Maple Fields that morning. Having seen the reports on the news and the police network and knowing the description of the man in question, she approached Joseph and let him know that he was wanted for questioning. And surprisingly, surprisingly, Joseph didn't fight. He followed Sergeant Nolan out of the store and into the back of the police vehicle to be taken to the State Patrol Barracks in St. Albans. Once in custody, he spilled everything. Joseph told police that he'd killed Emily in Bolton early Saturday morning and that her body was in the camper. Police raced to Meadowbrook Lane where they found Rosie, the camper van. Inside the bathroom of the vehicle, wrapped in garbage bags, were Emily's remains. As soon as the parts were discovered, the forensic team got to work. Joseph was charged with first-degree murder, with his arraignment being scheduled for the very next day. But before anything else could be done, police needed the full story. Joseph told detectives that on the way to Vermont, he and Emily had begun arguing. The transmission began smoking, which irritated them both and soured the mood. The argument escalated and Joseph pulled over. When he did, he alleged that Emily became aggressive and kicked him in the groin. And after the pair calmed down, they continued on their journey. Joseph told police that the argument continued when they arrived in Bolton, and that evening, he continued to drink Red Bulls and smoke. Emily went to lie down, and Joseph sat on the couch for 5 to 10 minutes just thinking. Then, as he said in his interview with detectives, he got up, retrieved his 19 from the sock bin, covered her face with a red throw pillar, and shot her twice in the side of the head. And the autopsy on Emily's remains confirmed this. The camper van itself was brought to the St. Albans Police Barracks, where the forensic team found the murder weapon, a 19 semi-automatic pistol. They also found another 5 guns with ammunition and a large amount of cash. Over the previous year, Joseph and Emily had only made about $4,000 in verifiable income. Joseph had reported he'd had $10,000 in cash, but $20,000 was found in the camper. In his possession, he'd also listed the 2016 Jeep and 2022 Ducati motorcycle, as well as another unspecified motorcycle. Both motorcycles had been given to friends to hold on to before the murder. So it would seem like the case was pretty simple, right? Police had the evidence, the body, the murder weapons, the murder scene, and Joseph's confession. But at Joseph's arraignment the next day, which was held on closed-circuit television, he entered a plea of not guilty despite having just confessed not even 24 hours before. So the case would go to trial, with Joseph claiming he shot Emily in self-defense. But there would be a long wait before that could happen. Firstly, Joseph couldn't afford representation, so he was awarded a public defender. In addition to this, in December of 2022, Adrian and David Bass filed a civil complaint against Joseph for Emily's death. They won, with the total estimate being $1.5 million. Obviously, Joseph would never be able to pay this, but there was another motivation behind it. If he ever tried to sell his story to the press, all the proceeds would go to Adrian and David, ensuring that he would never ever be able to profit from Emily's death. Another good thing that happened, Remington the dog was found safe and sound not long after Joseph was detained. In August of 2023, Joseph's attorney requested additional forensic testing on the used in the murder, further pushing back the trial date. In December of 2024, the trial was finally underway. Joseph was defended by Margaret Jansch, who was going to be facing off with Chittenden County State Attorney Sarah George. On December 11th, Joseph, with his hair slicked back in a ponytail and clad in a smart shirt and a tie, took the stand. The defense began the examination, and from the outset, the tone was gentle. Jansch asked Joseph to describe what meeting Emily was like. Joseph said the pair had just clicked. They were happy. Euphoric even. Things were good for a while, but soon there was a communication breakdown, specifically surrounding the polyamory clause. Joseph said that he would have to leave his phone unlocked for Emily to look through it to see who he was talking to. And then on the stand, Joseph introduced something that he hadn't really mentioned in his police interview. He said that not long into the relationship, Emily had started to become physically abusive. Joseph claimed that Emily would go through his phone and respond by beating him. When asked about this by the defense, Joseph said he figured it was normal and that most of his relationships had been marred by his partner physically harming him. And when questioned about the day of the trip, Joseph said that Emily seemed happy, if a little anxious, to meet his family. The pair left in the late afternoon, and when they arrived at the Airbnb complex in Bolton, the mood had shifted. According to Joseph, Emily became more and more hostile, and when he asked her why, Emily allegedly said that she had a dilemma. She pulled out her phone to show him a note she had written in the app app, but before Joseph could read it, she deleted it and refused to talk about it. Joseph told the defense that he wanted to get to the bottom of why she was upset and was desperately trying to engage in conversation with her. This was, of course, a clever tactic that he would use over and over again. From the start of his testimony, he painted himself as a benevolent bystander, trying so hard to save his relationship with his wife. On the stand, he alluded to Emily wanting to leave without ever saying, "She told me she was leaving me." He told his attorney that he had permitted Emily to leave and that he didn't want her to be unhappy. But then Emily exploded. She allegedly began swearing and saying what Joseph could only describe as hurtful things. So while all this was going on, Joseph reportedly made himself another drink and put on some music. Joseph maintained that he was determined to enjoy his vacation. He lit some candles, lit some incense, drank some more, and then began what he described as his yoga dancing. So Emily was sitting on the bed at this point, scrolling on her phone, and then she just lashed out again, this time about the candles being too bright. Allegedly, Emily ran up to Joseph, grabbed one of the heavy glass candles, and began hitting him in the face, neck, and arms. Joseph claimed he blocked the blows as he normally did when she got violent, telling Emily no hitting. Joseph then restrained her as she flailed around. She was in such a state that she eventually kicked the dog. And that, for Joseph, was too much. He took his and Remy outside. Now, you might be wondering what the has to do with this? Well, the campsite was way up in the mountains, and according to Joseph, when he had taken Remy outside earlier, he'd noticed a couple of eyes in the dark and figured a pack of coyotes was nearby. So in his mind, the which also had a silencer on the nozzle, was a good way to defend Remy against any predators. Joseph then testified that when he and Remy returned to the van, the argument with Emily continued and she ended up elbowing him in the groin as he climbed into bed to lay down with her. Then he claimed he grabbed one of the throw pillows, the red one, and swatted at Emily to get her to back off. According to Joseph, Emily then said, "That's it, you're dead." Then she reached under her pillow and pulled out the couple's small pistol. Joseph claimed that he felt a red wave of heat come over him as Emily came towards him with the gun. At the time, he was holding the and it's not clear if Joseph realized that admitting this on the stand was a major red flag. Why did he feel the need to climb into bed armed? Why was he holding it before Emily had even withdrawn her weapon? Either way, Joseph just continued to describe this strange scenario and what happened next. He said that was when he fired 2 shots. But this didn't make sense. He had described Emily as coming towards him, yet the shots had entered the left side of her head and come to rest on the other side of her pillow, meaning her head had been down when he'd fired. Additionally, that red throw pillow he mentioned swatting her with, that pillow had bullet holes in it, indicating that he had held it over her head. As Joseph continued to spin his story on the stand, the attorney asked him what happened after he shot Emily. He was silent for a few seconds, gathering his thought, and eventually he told the attorney that he yelled at Emily, asking her why she'd done that. As he described picking up Emily's body and realizing she was dead, Joseph began crying on the stand. But what's interesting about this is that at no point did he shed a tear. He only made a sobbing sound and placed his head in his hands. And here's another point that Joseph maybe didn't consider. On the stand, while being forced to describe what happened after he killed Emily, he had to admit that he carried on like normal. He drank some, made coffee in the morning, and texted his sister asking to meet for breakfast. And at no point did he tell his sister Nicole what had happened. He just said Emily had taken off with some friends. So why lie if it was self-defense? Well, that's what the attorney asked. Joseph paused yet again before giving the most baffling answer possible. First, he said he didn't want to bring his drama into Nicole's trip. Then, he said that he lied because a few months prior, he had told his grandmother that he was coming to Pennsylvania to place her in another care home and help her get her life together. Joseph maintained that if he had told people that Emily was dead, the police would be called and he wouldn't be able to honor his promise to his grandmother. Once again, Joseph is the nice guy. But the defense couldn't ignore the obvious. Jansch asked, quote, "Why didn't you just go straight to Pennsylvania instead of hanging around all weekend?" unquote. And once again, Joseph paused and stuttered before eventually saying that he wanted to take the opportunity to spend time with his sister. Another issue that was brought up during Joseph's testimony also related to what he did after the murder: the mutilation of Emily's body. Joseph claimed he didn't stab Emily after she died, or rather, he had no memory of it. According to him, he had a flash of a memory of cutting into her leg, but he said he stopped and vomited. He said several times he got sick over and over again after that. Of course, this was a great way to try to humanize his disgusting actions. He'd try again to explain away his actions by assassinating Emily's character. On the stand, he delved deeper into the allegations of abuse. He claimed that Emily had installed a ring camera in his tattoo studio to try to keep an eye on him. At this point, Joseph said the relationship was polyamorous, yet Emily still had a problem with it. But here's the question: if this arrangement was agreed upon by both, why would Emily have installed a camera? Wouldn't she just allow him to speak to whoever he was interested in? Unless the polyamory clause never even existed to begin with. And Joseph detailed another allegation of abuse, saying that when he unplugged the ring camera one day, Emily came in and assaulted him. Joseph reasoned that he should be able to talk and interact with his friends as he pleased. But according to him, Emily struck him with a closed fist just one of the many times that this had occurred. And previously he alleged that she had struck him with a wine bottle and a laptop. The attorney questioned Joseph and asked him how it was possible that a girl as petite as Emily, who barely passed 5'5", could come to injure a 200-pound, 6-foot man almost 2 decades her senior. And Joseph responded with the words, quote, "My nervous system was working pretty well," unquote. What? He was insinuating that because his body was in good condition, he felt pain. He added that Emily hit hard and that she wasn't a gentle person. The line of questioning in his testimony then deviated to how Joseph had tried to resolve things. He said the arguments continued, especially around the topic of having a child. In yet another character assassination of his wife, Joseph said that he didn't want to bring a child into the dynamic because he was scared for the baby, scared that Emily would hit the child. The couple did eventually see a counselor for their issues, but this was via Zoom and no in-person appointments were conducted, or at least at the point in time when it mattered the most. But perhaps the most important line of questioning once again circled back to that night, specifically the arrangement of the firearms in the camper. All the guns were registered to Joseph, including the that he claimed Emily favored because it was small. 6 guns are a lot, even if it's just for protection. And what's more, Emily wasn't known to have much experience shooting. Before she'd met Joseph, it's unknown if she'd ever even fired a gun. It was only after they met that he began taking her to target practice. Joseph explained again that after he'd shot Emily, he grabbed both guns, the Glock and threw them on the couch. But the details here are important because he claimed that Emily had the TARS in her hand. Forensics would have no way of verifying if this was true because A, he moved the body, and B, he threw the guns on the couch. It was only his word that they could go off of. So he admitted again that after this, he drank more and sat beside Emily's body for some time before placing a plastic bag under her head to catch the blood flow. Again, Joseph went for the nice guy angle, not even mentioning how he changed the sheets and pillows and threw her wallet and cell phone away, and even bought bleach in the following days to erase the mess. He'd slept beside Emily's body and driven around with it for at least 3 days. His actions showed an extreme lack of empathy. How do you coexist with the dead body of your spouse for days on end? And ultimately, Joseph does fit the typical profile of a perpetrator of femicide. The crime took place at home, following a dispute, likely after perceived disposition when Emily said she was leaving. This whole thing was about control, and the prosecution knew it. When Sarah George's turn came, she was anything but gentle. Out of the gate, she laid the scene, detailing how, while Joseph was dancing, drinking, and doing yoga, Emily wasn't in the mood for that. She'd realized her world was collapsing because of one very important detail that Joseph had left out. What Joseph didn't mention is that when the pair arrived in Bolton, they pulled outside the condo complex of Joseph's ex-wife. Yep, Nicole's Airbnb was where Joseph's ex-wife lived, and Joseph had known this all along. So naturally, this caused a problem for Emily and ruined any hope that she might have had for the trip. And so that night, Emily wants to go to bed. She calls Joseph pathetic and tells him she wants to exit the relationship and leaves him to stew on the couch. For 5 to 10 minutes, Joseph concocted a plan. He grabbed his grabbed the throw pillow, and executed his wife. When attorney George laid this out for Joseph, telling him he admitted these details in his police interview, Joseph repeatedly countered with the fact that he didn't remember talking to the police. He didn't remember the interview, and that for those days after the murder, he hadn't slept and his memory was fragmented. His entire defense was based on this, but the prosecution wouldn't back down. The accusations came hard and fast. Quote, "You didn't call 911. You didn't call your sister. You didn't call your ex-wife. Instead, you had another drink," unquote. Joseph couldn't deny this. Everything he had said to try to humanize his actions was pointless. As the prosecution explained, he didn't lay the bag under Emily's head, but tied it around her neck. He covered her face so he wouldn't have to look at what he'd done. Joseph had also shut Emily's phone off when she died, which he'd admitted in the police interview, saying, quote, "She wouldn't need it anymore," unquote. Yet on the stand, he claimed that Emily had turned off the phone herself. After the murder, as he gallivanted around Vermont, he continued to call and text Emily, calling her an asshole and saying that he didn't deserve this. Meanwhile, she laid in pieces in the bathroom of their camper van. He planned to bury her body in the woods. When the prosecution brought this up, Joseph once again tried to utilize the nice guy routine, saying that he was talking to Emily's body, telling her that he was going to honor her and give her the proper burial in the woods. When asked about repeatedly stabbing her over and over, Joseph simply said he didn't remember. But perhaps the most important detail that ties the state's argument together was in Joseph's interview with the police in the days after the murder, he hadn't mentioned that Emily had even had the or that she'd tried to use it against him. Self-defense didn't even come up. But before the trial, he introduced this new story into the narrative, most likely to try to get a lesser sentence. You'd think that for a self-defense claim, you'd include the most important detail for that the first time, wouldn't you? When the state closed its argument, Sarah George set a timer for 5 minutes, symbolizing the 5 minutes Joseph spent on that couch thinking of what to do next. It drove home the fact that it was premeditated, pure and simple. 5 minutes is more than enough time to refrain from acting on impulse. After closing arguments, it took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a guilty consensus. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole, and his sentencing is set for February of 2025. So with Joseph being found guilty, let's take a look at some of the details of whether or not it's plausible he was telling the truth. Firstly, who the defense and prosecution called as witnesses is very telling. The state called 15 witnesses, all testifying to Joseph's demeanor, including reports that there were no signs of bruising or scratches on him after the fight he'd had with Emily the night he killed her. As for the defense, they only had one witness, Joseph himself. Once more, it's his word against tons of evidence and confession. And then there's that initial police interview where Joseph didn't mention anything about self-defense. He also had no scratches, bruises, or injuries, which if Emily had kicked and elbowed him as hard as he said she had, surely there would be evidence of that. Technically, it is possible that Joseph was telling the truth. There were no witnesses, and there were no videos of the incident. Killing Emily in self-defense is in the realm of possibility, but it's highly unlikely. The real theory is that Joseph was self-centered, irresponsible, cold, sensation-seeking, and manipulative. He enjoyed multiple sexual relationships and was probably fueled by the age gap and client-artist dynamic. It's a power play. He murdered Emily on October 16th and will probably never know what really went down that early morning. And although he did his best to paint Emily as needy, violent, and desperate, prosecution and thankfully the jury saw through his ploy. Ultimately, what was meant to be a celebration of love became a nightmare of betrayal and butchery. A young woman, with her whole life ahead of her, was brutally slaughtered by the very person who had vowed to cherish her. Her dismembered remains, stuffed in garbage bags, serve as a grotesque monument to the depths of human cruelty. So the next time you see a happy couple embarking on a romantic getaway, remember the cautionary tale of Emily Jean Schwarz. Her story is tragic, horrifying, and sadly not as rare as we'd like to believe. Emily deserved so much more than to become another cautionary tale, and Joseph's conviction, while delivering some sense of justice, will never bring her back. But what do you think? Do you believe Joseph's self-defense claims hold any weight, or was his guilt clear from the start?